If we think and if we remember what we learned in our first model of comparative advantage based on differences in labor productivity, we remember that to determine comparative advantage, what really mattered was the amount of hours per worked that were used to produce soybeans and textiles, right? Here we have reported data on the labor force in a given country and the value of capital, and this gives us an information about absolute quantities if you want. However, as in the model that we have seen in lecture 3, what really matters is the relative endowment, if you want, of one factor relative to the other. In this case, we have a new definition, which is the definition of relative capital abundance. So what do? First, we divide the value of capital by the total hours of labor in the economy, and we see that the pictures and the magnitude change quite considerably. So before, we saw that China had the highest labor force and almost the highest capital stock. But once we divide the value of that capital stock by that very large labor force, we discover that the value of capital per worker is only $61,000. If we look at the same picture for the US and Mexico, we see that these numbers are way higher. In the US, the value is 5 times as high, about $300,000 of capital are allocated for each worker in the economy. In Mexico, this number is about $100,000 per worker in the economy. Perfect. So now that we have this relative measure of capital per worker, we are ready to give our first important definition that we're going to use in our new economic model, which is the notion of relative abundance in capital and in labor. Let's go back to consider our two countries A and B, and we say that if capital per worker in A is greater than capital per worker in B, then we say that A is relatively capital abundant. When the opposite is true, which means that labor per capita in country A is greater than labor per unit of capital in country B, then in that case we would say that A is relatively labor abundant. It follows immediately that if a country is relatively capital abundant, then it must be true that the other country is relatively labor abundant.